Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jane Barrett. I'm very proud to stand here as the Secretary-General of the International Federation on Ageing. Welcome to day one of the 16th Global Conference on Ageing, held for the very first time in Bangkok, Thailand. My job this morning is to moderate the first part of this very important meeting, Models of Integrated Long-Term Care, Principles and Practice. Before I introduce the International Federation on Ageing President, Mr. Graham Pryor, could I just thank very sincerely all those that came together in collaboration and partnership to inform the development and co-design of this important program. I will miss many people in my acknowledgements, but I do need to thank colleagues and friends from the United Nations and the World Health Organization. I also want to pay tribute to the Sao Foundation, and in particular Marianne and Paul Ong, who contributed significantly to this important program. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge Mr. Bernard Chan, Chairman of the Hong Kong Council of Services, that comes to us especially today to give welcome remarks. We have attendance from over 60 countries, and that is a real testament to the importance of this particular topic. So thank you. It's now my great pleasure to invite colleague, friend, and the IFA President, Mr. Graham Pryor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jane Barrett. It's wonderful to be here and to support this wonderful concept, idea, information sharing. Distinguished experts, including Mr. Bernard Chan, Chairperson of Hong Kong Council of Social Services, Dr. Sabine Henning, Chief Sustainable Demographic Transition Section, Social Development Division of the UN ESCAP, and of course, Dr. Marianne Sao, Chairman and Founding Director of the Sao Foundation. Welcome, one and all. Friends and colleagues, welcome to the expert meeting on models of integrated long-term care, principles and practice. My name is Graham Pryor, and while I'm proudly the President of IFA, I also sit at this meeting as the Chief Executive Officer of an organisation in Australia called the Hall & Pryor Health and Aged Care Group in Australia, and I'm also a Director on the board of Baycrest in Canada. As a contribution to the decade action area of long-term care, this meeting is informed by thought leaders and speakers in more than 10 countries, from Thailand to New Zealand, from India to Vietnam, from Canada to Hong Kong, and China to South Africa. We will hear from NGOs at the front line, such as Gravis and Help Age International, our colleagues at the UN Population Fund in the region, and the perspectives from WHO in Europe, and from those in South Africa who use socio-gerontological lenses to help drive policy, as has the Asia Development Bank and the ASEAN Centre. Leaders in the provision of services and design of technology from Canada and Hong Kong, alongside governments from New Zealand and industry medical centres, Mr. Kelvin Orr will round off this exciting and stimulating program today. Before closing these brief remarks, please permit me to acknowledge your expertise and your leadership. The spirit of collaboration in co-designing this program, which we will hope will be one of many where there is room for exchange of knowledge and good practice, robust discussion towards a common understanding of models of care that respect demography, cultures, and social and economic imperatives of each country on the globe. Thank you for your time this morning, and now my pleasure is to hand back to our wonderful leader, Dr. Jane Barrett.
Thank you, Graham. The International Federation on Ageing really acknowledges the very importance of government, non-government, industry, academic, and older people in helping to influence and shape policy. And so it's my great pleasure to now introduce Mr. Bernard Chan, Chairperson of Hong Kong Council of Social Services, Hong Kong, China. Mr. Chan is the Chairman and President of Asia Financial Holdings Limited, Chairman of Asia Insurance Company Limited, Executive Vice Chairman of our Hong Kong Foundation, and Chairman of M+ Museum. There are many aspects to Mr. Chan's career, his professional input, his professional direction, but just in those two sentences, Mr. Chan, you're a man that brings humanity to the leadership of the Hong Kong Council of Social Service. So, sir, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introductions. And ladies and gentlemen, first of all, good morning, very early morning. I'm going to get myself ready here. On behalf of the Hong Kong Council of the Social Service, I would first like to thank the IFA for organizing the 16th Global Conference on Aging and for bringing together such a distinguished group of speakers from both the public and private sector to share their insights and practical knowledge on models of the integrated long-term care and their responses to the UN Decade of Healthy Aging and the WHO Long-Term Care Framework. The theme for this conference, Challenge, Transformation, Change, encapsulate our shared mission and the challenges that we face in developing and implementing solutions to meet the needs of our aging populations. Now, of course, the practicality of generating sufficient funding to make this a reality for everyone. The study, the investigation of physical, mental, and social change in people as they age, and the application of this knowledge to policies and programs benefiting greatly from the rapid advances in technology. Now, we all share similar problems, but I have absolutely no doubt it is in the best interest of each and every one of us here today to utilize our resources and collaborate in finding and implementing solutions which will address the needs of the increasing numbers of people living longer. Our elderly deserve to live with dignity and in adequate solutions so that they can lead a healthy, happy, and fulfilling life until the end. In turn, the younger generations and society in general also benefit from the companionship and the wisdom of our elders. Long-term care provision and the improved social care system have been a high priority for respective Hong Kong governments, and around 1 billion Hong Kong dollars has been allocated to facilitate the adoption of Geron technologies in social care since 2018. To further facilitate partnerships and collaboration between the different stakeholders, the Hong Kong Council of Social Service has established a cross-sector Geron technology platform. And we are the co-organizers of the Geron Tech and Innovation Expo come the summit in November this year. Today, I would like to urge to all of you to reach out to our members of our delegations attending the conference to learn more about our ongoing efforts and explore all potential areas of collaboration. Providing the best possible quality of life of our seniors is our obligation, and ensuring the delivery of the adequate elderly care and rehabilitation is crucial to defining our success as a society. Finally, I'm hopeful that the dialogues and the exchange of ideas emanating from today's conference will make a valuable contribution and foster new collaboration which strengthen our relationship as we strive to address the needs of our cherished and aging population. The responsibility rests with everyone present to drive the agenda forward. Ladies and gentlemen, so I finished my official piece, but I just thought since I have the podium, I would like just to welcome you to visit Hong Kong, because of course we have been somewhat close to the world for a few years. We're still alive, and we're still very active, so we just want to welcome you back. And we're just 2.5 hours from here, but of course you're probably not going to make a trip this time. But do come back to visit us in November. We have a conference in October, and also an exhibition in November. So we welcome you back to visit us. We want to showcase to you what the type of developments we have in the last few years. Lots been happening. I know this is an IFA event, but since I've been introduced as the chairman of the M+ Museum, I also like to take this a moment to promote that. We opened probably by far the biggest contemporary art museum in Asia, in Hong Kong, while everyone else is locked out from Hong Kong, so you haven't seen it. It's brand new. It has the exact same size of Tate Modern in London, so it's fascinating. Has the single biggest contemporary Chinese art collections actually in the world. So welcome back. And by the way, I'm also from Thailand myself, so thank you for choosing Bangkok as your destination for this conference. Enjoy Bangkok, enjoy Thailand, and the rest of your stay in here. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
First and foremost, Mr. Chan, I think that you've just personally invited us all to Hong Kong. So thank you for that invitation, and you can count on me coming and knocking on your door. I think the important thing, or one of the important things that you talked about was collaboration, cross-sector, cross-discipline collaboration. And I have had the honour of going to this very important Gerentech Summit. It's extraordinary and growing rapidly every single year. So before I introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sabine Henning, I would like all of the delegation of Hong Kong to actually stand up. So please, when you're out drinking coffee, eating all of that wonderful food, just take some time to really connect. This conference is not only about the exchange of knowledge, it's about a platform for engagement, meaningful discussions, because it's only through that that we move forward and understand what the real tangible solutions are and how we can apply them to current and future generations of older people. What a pleasure it is to be up here and introducing, people that I have talked with over Zoom for so many years. And one of those is Dr. Sabine Henning. Sabine has been at the forefront of many initiatives across this region. And we just recently interacted and engaged again around the review of the United Nations Madrid International Plan of Action on Ageing. And it was an extraordinary consultation that brought together some of the delegates that are here today, to the round table to talk about how we progressed since 2002. An extraordinary effort from UNESCAP to bring so many voices to the table. Sabine Henning, Chief Sustainable Demographic Transition Section, Social Development Division, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific region. And I think we need to start shortening these titles, Sabine. Sabine is currently leading work on population and development ageing, migration and youth. It's an interesting combination, isn't it? Population and development, ageing and migration, and youth, with a focus on research, capacity building and intergovernmental support. It's a great pleasure, and thank you so much for your collaboration, your partnership and your input. It's been just a pleasure working with you. Thank you, Sabine.
Good morning. Mr. Graham Pryor, IFA President, Mr. Bernhard Chan, Chairperson of the Hong Kong Council of Social Services, Dr. Marian Tsao, Chair and Founding Director of the Tsao Foundation, Dr. Vania de la Fuente Nunez, former Technical Officer at the WHO and now Independent Consultant. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you to the International Federation on Aging for inviting the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP in short, to participate in this very important meeting just prior to the IFA conference. Through my opening remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to provide a bit of context for this conference in terms of Asia and the Pacific. First, a few words about the United Nations Economic and Social Commission, or ESCAP. It is one of the regional development arms of the United Nations Secretariat. We have 5, but this one is based in Asia and the Pacific. We're based in Bangkok. We are the largest in terms of extent. We're also covering, of course, the most people in the world. And in terms of older persons, we're covering 60% of the world's older population here in the region. So this is a very important regional commission. We work on capacity building and technical support. We provide an intergovernmental platform for member states to come and discuss and set norms, but also ensure that discussions at the regional level also inform discussions of member states at the global level. And of course, we are producing knowledge products such as databases, publications, etc. We have 53 member states, governments, and 9 associated member states, and we also, of course, work very closely with CSO, including the IFA. Okay, no. There seems to be a bit of a okay, there we go. While the slide is loading, I hope. Is there? Sorry. Okay. Okay, thank you. Now, as I said, we are providing an intergovernmental platform, and last year we were convening the 4th review and appraisal of MIPA, the Madrid International Plan of Action, the global guiding document on population aging. We are mandated as regional commissions to convene this meeting on a regular basis, and this informs the global review. So in 2022, we organized this meeting with member states, and of course we had also CSO participating. The outcome document of this meeting is on the slide, and I'm just highlighting the paragraph that I think important to our meeting today on long-term care. As you can see in the outcome document, member states committed to develop and implement high-quality, integrated and long-term care systems with public, private and community providers. They also pointed out that there's an economic aspect to long-term care, and it's an employment strategy for people, which we should also remember. We also need to recognize the contributions of formal and informal caregivers, and of course, the role of women in all of this. Often the women are the ones that are looking after their older family members. They themselves are older, but they also look after children and grandchildren, and they work outside the home. So we need to remember this, and also these commitments by member states as we discuss long-term care models today. Now let me step back and talk about the region. In 2020, the UN Economists Network noted 5 major trends that are shaping the world, that are shaping sustainable development. Technologies, urbanization, inequalities, climate change, and demographic trends. And among those demographic trends, population aging was highlighted as the most important trend. Now, it's important to relate this then also to the 2030 agenda, which is our agenda to achieve sustainable development by 2030. And we are far behind. Member states recognize that we are not on track to achieve so many sustainable development goals. I will not talk about this. I will just talk about how these SDGs, as we call them, relate to population aging. And if you just look at the slide, you see that many of the goals are so closely connected to population aging. The call to have no poverty, to leave no one behind, zero hunger or end of hunger, gender equality, all of this relates to older person. And above all of this, we need data in order to ensure that countries are on track to support countries in doing their own work. We need data. We need data disaggregated by age and sex and other criteria. So it's extremely important that we invest in data collection, dissemination, analysis. In terms of population aging in the region, and you will all know this region is leading the way. In 2023, 60% of all older persons in the world were living in this region. And the number of older persons will grow, will continue to grow in the region, of course worldwide, but especially in this region. 1 in 7 people by 2050 in the world will be an older person from Asia and the Pacific. Now, if we look at the numbers for the region, you see that between 1950 and 2023, the numbers almost doubled. And they're expected to double again to 1.6 billion by 2100 or 1.3 billion by 2050. Of course, these are population projections, but they show the way. Countries from the region currently account for 5 out of the 10 countries in the world with the largest number of older persons. Why are we observing this? It's because of actually an achievement. We need to recognize this, that why we're here is actually a human success story. It's because of this, what I'm showing on the graph. It's because of the decline in fertility over the years, and sometimes very rapidly in the region, the increase in life expectancy and increase in longevity overall. And this happened throughout the region. In the 1960s, on average, women in Asia Pacific had about 6 children. Now that number is much lower. It's at about replacement level. And as we know, in many countries of the region, it is below replacement level. It's not 2.1 children per woman. It's much lower than that. And this, as I said, is something that we would call a human success story. It's a result of improved health, medical advancement, hygienes, higher levels of education for women, giving them a choice to determine when to have children, how many children to have. So it's something very positive, and we need to celebrate this. Of course, it presents challenges, in particular if it happens very rapidly, as this graph shows you. The transition from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality, or the demographic transition as we call it, occurred very fast here. And this graph shows you the number of years it took for countries in the region to increase the share of their older population from 7 to 14%. As you see, many countries in the more developed north, like the United States, New Zealand, but also Australia, some of the countries from the region, took many years to increase this share. They had more time to prepare for the number of older persons that were yet to come. However, in Asia Pacific, this transition is occurring much faster. It's very rapid. And so, as some people say, countries in the region are growing old before they're growing rich. What I also would like to point out, and this is also something very familiar to you, is of course as life expectancy increases, the share of the older women increases as well, because women live longer. So, and this is over age groups. So you see that across the region, of course, the share of older women increases significantly. We need to keep that in mind when we talk about population aging and what are the needs of older persons. There are specific needs and also opportunities for women to contribute. So let's not forget the gender dimension in our discussion. Now, I have a few slides here on life expectancy. I would assume my colleague from the WHO will probably cover some of this, but you see that despite these overall trends, there's quite a bit of diversity in the region in terms of, for example, life expectancy. Here I'm showing countries with highest life expectancy, of course, at age 60. Some of them are still projected to have about 20 more years and 25 more years to live, which is remarkable. On the other side, however, in the same region, however, in a different sub-region, older persons have fewer years to live compared to these high achievers. You also see that the female advantage in life expectancy differs, and it's much smaller in countries that are lagging behind in terms of life expectancy increases. Now, what I would like to relate this to is, of course, social and economic situation of many of the older persons. And it is well known that social protection is relatively low in many countries of this region. And one aspect, for example, would refer to pension coverage. This is a graph that shows the working age population, people working today covered by a pension. And as you see across the region, the numbers are relatively low, and they are particularly low again for women. Women who have few opportunities in education, in the job market, who are the caregivers, and they are not expecting social protection in old age. They will fall behind, as we say at the United Nations. So this is something, again, we need to keep in mind. Social protection being very low, people not necessarily covered through these systems in old age. An important aspect, of course, is healthcare coverage, universal healthcare coverage. This is data from the SDGs, from the Sustainable Development Goals, again, across the region, showing you that, again, many countries are falling behind. There is no healthcare coverage of their population, or if there is, it's at very low levels. And you see in particular countries in the Pacific or in South and Southwest Asia are falling behind. Now, what this also relates to is then the cost, because people will then have to pay out of their own pockets to cover for health care. And as we see in this graph, if you focus in particular on the upper part, public health care expenditures are overall low, which leads then to high out-of-pocket expenditures. This is an important fact to remember, that many older persons are not covered, and if they have issues, they have to pay out of pocket. And often this leads to catastrophic experiences, people not being able to cover their own expenses, falling behind, incurring debt, etc. Another important aspect is about living arrangements of older persons as we talk about long-term care. In the region and throughout the region, older persons in general remain within the family. However, with declining fertility and more people moving to the city, especially the younger people, older persons are left alone, left behind, often in rural areas. And so we see that there is clearly a tendency towards smaller family sizes, and so few people to be around to look after older persons. And as I said, often this would then fall on the older women to look after their older family members. And you see this throughout the region again. Now, let me just summarize a few key takeaways, and this is coming also out of the meeting we convened, the intergovernmental meeting last year. What are the issues in general, not only with a view to long-term care, but when we talk about population aging here in the region? It's important to think about population aging over the life course. It's not something that happens at age 60 or 50. We need to think about healthy and active aging over our life courses. And we need to provide opportunities for all of us, and of course for the older persons, to age actively, in dignity, and with their full respective rights. We have to think about removing the formal barriers to work. In some countries here in the region, we have still relatively low retirement ages, and they're even lower sometimes for women. Again, this is something governments should reconsider and make it more flexible to older persons to retire when they want. Of course, they would then also need to invest in creating age-friendly work environments And that's something, some countries actually in the region are already spearheading. So that's another issue to consider. As I said, social protection is low, and there's much work ahead of us for all of us here in the region. The influence of technology and digitalization is important, and it's important to recognize that, yes, as much as we have all benefited from the progress made in the region, especially over the last 2 years where we had to rely on our phones and on the internet, those who did not have access were even worse off than before. And so the digital divide was growing. So that's another important topic to consider. I talked about the gender aspect. I have to mention, of course, disabilities increase as the number of older persons grows. So we need to recognize there is a clear correlation, and we need to understand that there are also special needs of older persons with disabilities. We will talk about healthcare today and long-term care in particular. We talked about the importance of integrated care, community-based, and we're very much looking forward to listening to you and learning from your experiences. We will not talk about it here, but climate change is there. And this region is highly affected by climate change. Older persons are affected. But we should not only think about them as victims. They can also be brought into the discussion and into finding ways to adapt and mitigate. So they also have an active voice and role to play in all of this. And lastly, of course, vaccines, something that we still need to consider and address, provide equal, timely, equitable access to vaccines now and in the future. And with that, I thank you again very much for inviting the United Nations Economic Commission, and I look forward to the deliberations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henning. What you've done is not only for this meeting, but for the entire conference, really created an important platform that touched on the demographic upheavals of our time: population ageing, migration, urbanisation and globalisation. I bring this up here because, we are in the midst of the UN Decade of Healthy Ageing. And what Dr. Henning talked about was really the intersection of the work of the UN and the WHO. And so take your time to actually consider your role, your organisation's responsibilities within the Decade of Healthy Ageing and beyond, because it's the intersectionality of the 4 action areas: long-term care, age-friendly environments, combating ageism and integrated care, crossed with the enablers. So thank you very much for your time, Sabine, and thank you once again for your cooperation and your partnership. Let me just put this down. I seem to talk with my hands, so if I'm holding on to things, it's not helpful. It's rare to be part of a community, a global community, where you can meet a person one day in 1 year, and some 16, 17, 20 years later, you can greet them as if you met them yesterday. That's what this global community is about. And that's what Marianne Sau is about. That's who she is. Marianne and I met a long time ago, but I met you this morning and it was like we had breakfast yesterday. So thank you. But during that time, your leadership, your influence, the power of your humanness has really permeated across this region and around the world. And it's an honour to know that you're with us today. Let me just say a few words, Marianne. And what you're going to be doing is setting the scene and overview of long-term care models, types and ranges. Marianne needs no introduction, but let me just pull out a couple of phrases. A champion. I would add influencer. I would add humanitarian. I would add friend, colleague, mother, all of those. So a champion of elder care and ageing issues. And as chairwoman and founding director of the Sau Foundation, You have walked in the steps of your grandmother in empowering older adults. The Sal Foundation was founded in 1993, and it strives to make innovative strides in community-based elder care training and education, helping seniors in Singapore to stay healthy and independent. But that really is the narrow view of who you are, what the Sal Foundation does, and how we can learn from your expertise, experience, and also the spirit and goodwill that you convey through your leadership at the Sal Foundation and across the region. Thank you very much.
Wow. Jane, I don't think I deserve all that, but thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Anyway, Mr. Graham Pryor, Dr. Jane Barrett, friends and colleagues here, good morning. I just really want to thank IFA for inviting me here to talk about, share a bit of my experience with long-term care. As Jane mentioned, I came to Singapore from New York 30 years ago. The foundation is celebrating a 30th anniversary this year. When I first arrived from Singapore in 1992, before the foundation was launched in 1993, older people were invisible. No one knew anything about older people or issues. Sometimes a bit about families, certainly not the policymakers. But older people are dying alone in the flats by themselves with too often. And people don't really know that they died until some days later because you can't avoid it anymore. It still happens today, but happy to say it is much less often than before. But since 1993, our battle cry has been aging in place and taking care of older people in the community so they can live well. So I'm happy to say that now I think the notion of aging in place and supporting older people in the community so they can live well is no longer such an unusual issue as it was way back then. So I'm trying to see where slides are. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit dorky with this sort of thing. Okay. So today, I know that Dr. Vanya de la Fuentes Nunez will be speaking about long-term care at a sort of higher level. And I'm a practitioner, so I thought what I'll do is I'll start from bottom up, talk about what it's like to work with older people who need long-term care and what it looks like, and therefore what it should be, some of the challenges and some of the elements that we're going to look for moving forward from community older people perspective. So normally when we think about older people with long-term care, it would definitely not be these guys, right? They look fitter than I. And maybe not even these guys. These ladies look pretty perky. They may not be the fittest, but certainly they're not people who would use long-term care. When we think about long-term care, we might think maybe more of someone like this, someone a bit more frail. They can, still carry on, but they have a little difficulty taking care of the shopping and getting a house clean and all that sort of thing. Or someone like this, looking pretty happily demented perhaps. They have dementia, cognitive impairment. They can no longer try to take care of themselves, even though they look pretty well. Or people like that who increasingly become frail, bedbound, homebound, and really needs quite a lot of care. So as you can see, it's really not one size fits all. People with disability and frailty who need long-term care are very, very different. And so therefore, actually, it's like when we look at long-term care, it's not one thing. It's really what that person, that circumstance would really need. So we all know what we're talking about when we talk about long-term care, right? Am I behind like one slide? I think I went, okay, there we go. Sorry, a little bit dorky with this sort of thing. But anyway, but we all know that what long-term care is about is really about supporting older people who has no longer able to take care of themselves in a day-to-day life. They have chronic diseases, accidents, other mental or physical illnesses that cause those disability. And so they really require support. But the whole point of that is actually for them not to just to get care. It's really to provide the support for them so they can live well and die well. Living well is the key. We don't give them care so they can live. They get care so that they can live and live the life they want. So I think it's really important to understand what long-term care's aim is about. It's not just about giving the physical bits of things. Of course, I'm skipping ahead of myself here. So anyway, so people, just a little bit of interesting information about long-term care. So actually, of course, anybody can have long-term care needs, but most of them, they're actually older people affected disproportionately. And of course, I didn't even know this. I just read this in the WHO report that 2 out of 3 older people are likely to require long-term care at some point in their life. And of course, with women, people living alone, people low economic social classes are more likely to have long-term care. And globally, there's 140 million people now who need long-term care. That's the size of the population of Russia. So it's a lot of people. Okay, so back to, okay, what's long-term care about? So like I said, it's really about service to help older people to be able to live in a community so they can live well. Oftentimes, the focus really needs to be on the customized care. It's not just, like I said, one size fits all. It's actually whatever that person may need at the time, and actually has interaction between what they can do, what they cannot do, as well as the environment they're in. So if someone lives in a house that's kind of got up very easily, that's one thing. Someone lives on a 4th-floor apartment with no elevator is something different. So kind of know that it's actually interaction between what they need and also the physical environment, and also the transportation they can get out and around so they take care of it with having their life. The provision of long-term care is often by both informal and formal caregivers. Informal caregivers, we know, are mostly family members and all. And in Asia, at least, there's this tendency to hire women from other countries to become the helper at home. So oftentimes Singapore, I think Hong Kong, Taiwan as well, the solution to long-term care of older relatives is a hire helper, sometimes from Philippines, from Myanmar, somewhere else. The women who leave their own parents, their children behind, that become the care for our older relatives. One professor friend was that it was like outsourcing filial piety, you know? So the solution is to hire somebody, take care of elder, cook and clean, and everything else, which of course is not good for the women working as an informal caregiver, nor it is for the people, the family, or the older person receiving that care. And so I think that, but however, a lot of other times, the caregiver is in fact a family member. Okay. So, there are different kinds of long-term care. It could be in various settings. It could be in a home. It could be in a center where people are transported to a place where they can gather together, or it could be residential facilities. My point of saying here is that we're not talking about residential facilities, so we're going to only focus on community-based care. And this is a laundry list of things you can do, but what are the types of services is fundamentally everything you may need to have your day-to-day life. If you think about getting out of bed, I mean, for most of us, just get out of bed. For people who have disability and functional loss, getting out of bed is hard. Getting out of bed, combing your hair, getting dressed, eating breakfast, all those are difficult when people have decline in functions. So just think of what long-term care, the components of all the stuff we need for day-to-day living, okay? So it could be like the housekeeping, laundry, meals, personal care. Like I said, they may need help to get out of bed and get dressed and all that. And increasingly, healthcare is part of that. It used to be some years back, there's a big debate. What's long-term care? Is it social care? Is it health care? It's neither nor. It's actually both. Because look at the person, they need both. Oftentimes, people need long-term care with functional disabilities, have diseases that there's a medical situation. So need to get the medical care and to get a social care so that they can be the best they can be and live the way they be. But other things I want to say is it's not passive. A lot of them can be supported with the ability for self-care. It's not just sitting passively to receive your care. So they actually should be supported in terms of understanding self-care, and as well as supporting the caregivers in that. And Singapore, quite often, the first, some years back, I remember making a home visit, there was an older gentleman tied up in a chair in the bathroom. And the family was saying, he's so misbehaving, he goes out, wanders off, gets lost, and then, he ate breakfast and he gets upset with us because they said that we didn't give him breakfast. And of course, his family didn't understand that this older person actually has dementia. So oftentimes, and even if you diagnose it in a panic, what does this mean? How would that affect the older person? What affect their care? So you really have to educate the caregiver about what it means when you're supporting care for an older person with whatever issues they have. And of course, caregiving is hard. I was a caregiver to my grandparents and my parents, and I'm, obviously have lots of resources. So I know what I'm doing, can purchase service available, but it is very, very hard. You're constantly worried about whether they're doing well. So I think, generally speaking, supporting a caregiver, needless to say, is important. And I just want to say that I want to say a little bit more about care management, but I think I'll illustrate that a little later. So The more important thing for me is actually what do people want? What are we trying to do with long-term care? Are we just trying to give them services so that they can carry on, get out of bed and brush their teeth and have their meals? Or is it really supporting older people to be who they are or who they want to be? Everyone's different. We're as different, everyone here is different from each other. As we grow older, as all of us in aging know, we become even more different because our life course, our temperament becomes more different. So the key, I think, to me as a practitioner community is understand what we're trying to achieve with long-term care. It's not just about giving them care so they can get out of bed and all that sort of thing. It's really about supporting a person so they can lead the life that they want to lead. I like that. I like to be able to live my life the way I want to lead, regardless of the shape or form I am physically or mentally. So these are some common things we found, and actually we observe this in the people we work with, and in research more and more we see this to be the case. People want to live in their own home. I don't know if I've worked with older people trying to move them, either to a nursing home or move them to the children's house or whatever, and oftentimes they dig their heel in, absolutely would not move. The house may be a big mess, they won't move. And I've been really fascinated by that, because as a younger person, I move around, so I go study, I work, seems to be not such a big deal. But I just realized that, because I've never been there, I don't know what it's like to be older. And I started to look into research about why older people really don't want to move when they get really significantly older. And it turned out that, of course, it's freedom to do whatever you want in your own house. It's your home. It's a mastery of your space. It's something familiar. Even if you lose a flight, you can move around. And also memories, a connection to the community. But also at times, it's about loss of the identity. They have been so connected to that place. And it's a time of loss for them. They're losing friends from death and illness. They're losing functions. And they don't want to lose the identity of being part of that space. So I would just say that don't think about moving older people with impunity, because it's really a big deal for them. It's very hard. So sometimes we say, oh, these older people are so stubborn. They're so difficult. They don't listen. I'm trying to help them. They're not helping me, right? And somehow we think that just because someone needs care, we can tell them what to do. We tell the kids what to do. But you know what? Kids don't even like being told what to do, and even less so when you're an older person. And this is your father, your mother. They feel already out of control, and someone's telling them what to do, what not to do. This is typical, right? Don't eat this, it's high cholesterol. Don't eat that because blah, blah, blah. You hear this all the time, out of good intention, but the road to hell is paid with those good intentions. It has to be reasonable, it has to be balanced, okay? Because telling people what to do makes them feel even more out of control. So it's really, really important that we try not to do that. And this whole thing about being master of their own destiny is exactly that. People want to be able to make decisions for themselves. People want to know they're in control of their life. People want to know that they can still aspire to a new day tomorrow. I can aspire to get up tomorrow. I can learn something new, do something for other people, and discover something by myself. And not to wake up for what reason. And sometimes we visit some of the seniors in nursing homes. They really feel like what ones whereby they're quite institutional. They feel like, they don't even know, they can make them get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, make them shower in the middle of the night, eat whatever they're given. They have no choice over their day-to-day life. And we don't even know what it feels like to have to do that. So it's really important that we really understand who they are, what they want to do, so that when we provide care, the care is for the purpose, for supporting them so they can lead the life that they want, and not just to receive care to live, just to be alive. I'm just kind of on a stump here because definitely, if we've seen when we care with good intention, people are happy. If we care with good intention but really don't know what that person wants, what they need, or who they are, it's really hell. So I just want to make a point of that. Okay, so what does it mean to have some of the key functions of community-based long-term care? Firstly, being person-centered. That's what I was talking about before. Don't think about what I think is good for you. You have to figure out what is that they need and what they want. Now, sometimes there might be quite a big distance. They kind of have to negotiate to a point whereby can all figure out what might be the best for them, and they can take on. And of course, I think this notion about the integrated care plan, you hear a lot about integration, is really about the big fancy word to say that you look at the person, you work with them, figure out who they are, whether it's health needs, social needs, whatever needs, it's the whole person. It seems kind of obvious, but it's somehow difficult for people to understand. It is something to do that just develop in conjunction with the older person. And sometimes a family caregiver of the older person cannot really make decisions, but also because sometimes the family caregiver wants different things. Sometimes you often see older people want to stay at home. Family caregiver want them to move to a nursing home. So you're stuck. You have to support a caregiver, you also support older person. So sometimes it really takes a skillful care managers to negotiate what might work out. So you kind of have to create these plans, co-create these care plans with older person and the family. So it seems obvious, but oftentimes, well, I think we know better. We make care plans up because we think this is what's good for you. And oftentimes it doesn't work because that's not what they want. I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I used to walk around the housing blocks to do outreach. There was this lady with this huge belly, so big, there was a lot of fluids in belly. She was walking around with a stool because her belly is so heavy, she didn't have walking frame. So with the doctor thinking, oh, this is terrible, I've got to do something about this. You know, like, this person must be something horrible going on in the belly. But she's like, what's the big deal? Don't bother me, I have this for my long time. I'm functioning. And so, but we don't give up, keep going back, trying. And one day she goes, doc, this itch is driving me crazy, And turned out a little tiny eczema, so I gave her some cortisone cream. Wow, this doctor's good. Because I met her where she was. It mattered to her. The big belly mattered to me, but the itch mattered to her. So I think that was a really good lesson that I should never assume we know what's good for people, that what I think is important for them is what's important to them, themselves. So it's really something about a person-centeredness, really something that we really could not emphasize enough. And of course, a service delivery is, and this has to be timely. Sometimes with a meal service, we'll deliver 7 in the morning, lunch and dinner. Of course, it's a hard thing to do to get in, but it's like eating cold food with like little dead fish floating around. They weren't eating it. It's just like, it's just not palatable. So a timely delivery service, whether it's a meal service or whatever other kind of service, has to be timely. Okay. So I think of pretty much everything. So the service has to be accessible, affordable, adequate, timely, all those wonderful things. But of course, on the ground, delivery is a little tricky, but nonetheless, it's something that we can do. Okay, so the care manager is really what I talked about, the really important part. The care manager is a person who really tries to understand the older person, the family, the circumstances, the physical environment, and figure out what is this that they want. And like I said, it's not always so easy to do, but one must really try. And that you really come up with a care plan, not to say, not your care plan, my care plan, it's their care plan. It's something they really want. And sometimes they do it bits and pieces, right? You treat the itch first, and then you deal with the belly later, but some are rather get to it, but you actually have to do something that they can actually accept. Okay, so I'm going to show a really fancy slide, which is I borrowed from my colleague Paul, who should get all the credit for helping with the programming because he's really the one who did it. But I'm borrowing it because it just shows a whole kind of life course approach to thinking about how people live. So you start on one end, on the left hand is red, is healthy bit. But as we grow older, we like to think that we stay red, healthy all the way, and just drop dead. That would be great, but generally speaking, it doesn't happen that way. And so over time, people become, have more illnesses, they start to lose function, there's some decline, eventually not really sick, but not really healthy. There's something that eventually they get pretty sick, and then they have palliative care and die. And so when you talk about long-term care, it's really about following that person through this continuum. Sometimes they get better, and sometimes get worse. So you kind of have to follow that person. It's like I said, not one size fits all. It's always following the person as to where they are and trying to provide the most appropriate package of services, whether it's a personal care, whether it's transportation, whatever, and that supports their ability to live as independent as possible with a quality of life that they wish as much as possible. And you kind of move back and forth with them. And underneath it, other than just sort of long-term care in the social sense, like the transportation, housing, all that, is actually the primary care. Everyone's need primary care from beginning to end, but what they need in terms of the support varies, depends on the functional ability. And I want to emphasize the fact that sometimes people do get better. I remember in the clinic one day, this lady who's been taken care of dragged this husband kicking and screaming into the clinic because the husband's just driving her crazy. It turned out the husband came in, a rather big man in a wheelchair, fussing because this gentleman, the husband, that was fine to maybe 3-4 months before and had pneumonia. ended up in the hospital for maybe 6-7 days. In the hospitals, there was a time when they didn't let anybody get out of bed because they don't want the patients to fall. So everybody is a fall risk, just to have to stay in bed. And you know, you lie in bed for 5, 6, 7 days, an older person, they lose muscle, they walk in, and they couldn't quite exactly walk out. And this gentleman was an older gentleman. When I go home, you're supposed to take care of me. So she was bossing the wife around, doing everything for him. But the point is that other than that, he was just sitting all the time. 3-4 months later, he's in a wheelchair, can't walk anymore. So when he came to the clinic, we realized there's actually no pathology. He didn't fall, didn't have broken hip, did not have a stroke. He's simply from disuse and went from walking to being in a wheelchair and was needing all the care. So we simply put this guy through an exercise program, and he likes to dance. So we motivate him to say that if you keep doing this, can dance. And 3 months later, the guy can dance. So oftentimes, just don't take that disability face value. There are a lot of things can do sometimes to move them back towards the red end more. Okay, and so really always like really just not just slice. Look at that person as who that person is. What was their past joys, like dancing? What's a future aspiration? And try to understand what will motivate the person to do more for themselves. Okay, sometimes they're depressed because, you know, one day I'm walking, next day I'm in a wheelchair, and I think I'll never get better again. So we have to look at not just the physical aspect of things, but the socio-emotional part. We live our life by how we feel about things. And we can't understand who this person is, how they feel, what will motivate them to want to change. No matter what kind of fancy service throw at them, it won't really work. Okay, so the key about long-term care is not about just the physical bits of things. It's about really supporting the person to be the best they can be for themselves, lead the life they want. A lot of it is psychological, emotional, social. Okay, so don't stop at giving them just physical care. It's a lot about is that person. That's why the care coordinator is so important. Oftentimes someone from a community, someone that knows them, and really understand the past and the history and all that. So it's really important to figure out who they are, what they want, and other than the, you know, the physical care bit, transportation, housing bit is what would take this person to be happy. Okay, so you're not responsible for them. They're responsible for it, but you have to try to facilitate that as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to just show you a case because that's a little easier to show. I think those of you who know about care management, just bear with me, but I thought it's kind of good to show. This gentleman, Mr. Ng, was a seaman. This is a relatively straightforward case, actually, but I thought it's good enough to illustrate a few things. He was a man about town, stopping at different ports of calls, probably have girlfriends everywhere. This guy fell, broke his back, became paraplegic. They want to send him to a nursing home. Over his dead body, he's just going to literally die. He was trying to do that. So, but he's spunky, he's motivated, and they sent him to us. And they said, no way this guy who lives on the floor with no elevator will be able to live at home. He lives alone. And he only has a bit of money, not poor enough to be on public assistance, but not a lot of money either. So this is what happens. This is to show how important the physical space is. So he can bottom shuffle. So we just moved everything onto the floor. The bed's on the floor, the little kitchen is the little cooking dish on the floor, everything's on the floor. So we actually kind of shuffle around and kind of more or less take care of himself. He doesn't really need personal care. He actually can do this pretty well. But he couldn't get out, right, unless he's a wheelchair. This is, we call it his Porsche, because it's a lightweight, small wheelchair. The traditional wheelchairs can't get through the door, but this is actually good enough. So he likes this little wheelchair. And so we taught him how to get in and out of the wheelchair by himself, okay? So he can do it, get in and out by himself, can get himself dressed. And he's a rather tidy guy. He doesn't like his clothes wrinkled. So we actually just shrunk up a line. And in Singapore, a lot of places you have these like laundry poles, like they hang the laundry out to dry. So we just cut it, make it a little shorter. It has a little tip on the end. We strung up a rope, and then his clothes are just hung up. He hangs up and take them down with this little stick. The same little stick turns off the light. And he couldn't really quite get in and out of the wheelchair because there's a threshold of maybe 2 or 3 inches. So we can't get in and out. So we just got some volunteer to make up a little wooden plank where she fishes in and out with a little string, a little hook. He can get out. And that little stick he uses to put it back. And then a friendly locksmith just dropped the lock down so he can actually lock up. We have to move him to a floor with elevator landing. So, but luckily there's another flat in the same building that looks much like the same as his. So I was able to move him downstairs. He didn't mind that. And he's able to barely reach the elevator button, but he can do it. and then get him out of the house. And transportation was a big issue. That time, we were able to work with a church that happened to have a van, and that was transporting him to some rehab, to whatever he needs to go, rehab, to the clinic. So he was basically doing okay. We're able to work with some neighbors and friends like that to help him with some meals and that sort of thing. And here he is hanging out with his friends, smoking and drinking. So I say, no, this would say, Mr. Ong, really try not to smoke and drink. He doesn't have many health problems, some hypertension, whatever, but he obviously still need primary care. So he's just got his care organized. But, you know, he has a pretty decent life. And amazingly, a few years later, because he was not traveling around anymore as Seaman, fell in love, got married. He has a life. Otherwise, he would have been in a nursing home. Okay, and it took a while to get him organized, all the little things we did, get things organized, got him onto public assistance, all that sort of thing. But 6 months of work, and this guy, it's been 15 years, he's still around. Okay, so I think that my point is that you kind of figure out who they are and get them organized, the physical space, and get them the service they need. It might take some organizing, but they continue to have a quality of life. So care integration is important. Important because you have to coordinate things between healthcare, between social care, make sure transportation to get to the clinic, making sure that people are delivering food at the right time. Sometimes you have these friendly churches or temples that would like to deliver rations and stuff like that. Sometimes you go to a home and you have like stacks and stacks of rice and boxes of cookies and tins and tins of Milo, sometimes for diabetics. Milo is like a very sweet drink, right? So you can't have everybody do whatever they want. Some they get too much of one thing and none of the other. So a care coordinator, we used to call them renting a really smart daughter. Of course, it could be a son, but this is like someone who really has knowledge, but yet they care about the older person. They really do what a daughter would do, but they can get it organized much better because they know where to get resources. So, yes, it could be a smart son too, but smart daughter is very good. Anyway, so the care coordination is important. So at the individual level, you can actually integrate health and social care easily, well, relatively easily, because you're looking at the person, look at everything they may need. Okay, so you can get whatever they need. And a care coordinator doesn't have to be, of course, it can be a fancy place. We can have, like, can just call up and get transportation, this and that. But I can see in Mr. Ong's situation, you can't call things in. You're just trying to resourcefully find whatever can get in the community and figure out how things are. So care coordinators are often very resourceful, innovative, creative people, like that pole and the string for the clothes. I thought was pretty clever, that little stick that they use for everything. So you kind of have to see what resources there in the community, this resource they have, so they can bring to the fold. So individually, it's actually, if a good care coordinator, care manager, you can do a lot in integrating the care, social, or whatever care. I think the systems level is more complicated. So right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So you kind of have to create a system. All the people in the ecosystem needs to be connected in the service delivery system. So in Singapore, we do work very closely with the hospitals, the clinics, the doctors, the other providers, and string them together at one big party. We make them a network, and then actually get to know each other, can coordinate and create value-added synergies amongst all of us. And then we don't waste energy doing things you don't need or duplicate, and have a much better allocation. I think at the policy level has always been the hardest. In Singapore, was social, of course it's not just the social ministry, it's also the health ministry and then more. But those two, health and social agencies, often have to work the closest together. So in the beginning, if you have a program that's a nurse and a social worker, neither one will fund, because health people will say there's a social worker. Social people say you have a nurse. And they don't talk to each other. And it was terrible. So the government tried to make them date. It failed miserably. It just didn't work. So eventually everything went to health. But I think the problem is that, from my observation with other countries, if the health and sort of human services are not in the same department, it's complicated. How to make them kind of think together and work together is complicated. So I think care integration, obviously, is not just health and social care, but generally speaking, across transportation, other things as well, housing, many things. But I think definitely ministries have to get together. Singapore eventually figured it out. They actually have so the health minister became the de facto aging minister, and then they would actually have an aging planning office. So to get all the permanent secretaries across many ministries to come together and more or less to plan in a more coordinated fashion. And particularly on long-term care, they have one agency on integrated care which specifically only deal with long-term care. So it got better over time. So care integration is a really major piece, and care coordination is also very important. Okay, so I think caring for a caregiver goes without saying. Vast majority of older people are actually cared by the formal and informal caregivers. And formal caregivers, these are the folks who might be working in a day center, or they're delivering personal care, and it's oftentimes, generally speaking across the world, it's tough work. They often from another country. They very high intensity work, as physically, emotionally exhausting, and actually oftentimes they just have a lot of work and they're underpaid and all that kind of stuff. So this is really clear an issue. And I have a very specific gender perspective because most of the time, for many countries, these formal caregivers are women from other countries. And so that's a big can of worms that I don't think we really dealt with that really needs to be addressed. Okay, informal caregivers talked about already a little bit. 80 to 90+% of them are informal caregivers, family members, community friends. I think that for countries that have more services, it's about 80% are getting informal care. But for other countries, a lot of countries in our region, more than 90% of them would be just family care. Yeah, and so I think oftentimes in our experience, the caregiver is also an elderly person. Recently, we visited a family. It was because a neighbor called because the older gentleman kept getting lost, and they thought that something's wrong with him. So, of course, the gentleman has dementia. We went to the house, and he was being cared for by his elderly wife, who has diabetes, hypertension, and a whole lot of other things. There are 4 kids in the house, from 2 to 14. The middle generation, well, not around. So all the kids not going to school. So this older lady is trying to deal with these 4 kids running around the house, an older husband who has dementia, and she just couldn't get to anything. So sometimes when you look at care coordination, it's not just about older people, it's about the family. You have to think of the whole family. So increasingly, it's not just person-centric or just focused on diet of the caregiver and the one caregiver and the older person, it's whole family. In Singapore, I would say that even from like working class family up, the children pulled the money and hired this one foreign domestic worker, and that is the thing, right? And so it's just and what happens is the caregiver is actually the foreign domestic worker who has no decision-making authority. And then there'll be maybe a daughter somewhere who supervises this foreign worker, and then there'll be some other siblings who pays for care, who tells the daughter what to do. So sometimes for us to get something done, like we suggest this, your mother gets a service, whatever, it takes a long time to get a decision because it's so complex. So it's no longer even just one caregiver to one older person. It's that you have to take a family approach. And so our team now need to acquire additional family therapeutic skills, because to get families together to talk is really hard. In Asia, they tend to be in different countries somewhere, working elsewhere. And for them to come to the same table on the call to discuss, and they don't get along, it's tough to get a decision made for an older person. Okay, I'll just move along quickly. I'm sorry, I have trouble seeing. This is I couldn't see as far, that's too far for me as well. Anyway, so that's why sometimes I look down, okay, so don't mind me. All right, so this is other thing about caregiving. This is someone who said to me lately, there's a Chinese saying for everything. And so she said, where there's chronic disease, there's no filial son. So if in the old days, families are big, and then, you one older person who lived a long life, probably pretty healthy, but now small family, and then the ability to provide care diminishes. An older person live for many more years with disability, so it just wears them down. So it's actually, again, it's a gender perspective again. In Singapore, in some areas, oftentimes a single, unmarried daughter who is the one taking care of the older parents. And they give up economic opportunity, they're not making money, and when they grow older, they have no family, no children, no money. I think this is something that's really, really difficult. And I remember this, I was reminding myself, tell the story of Rebecca. So Rebecca was in her late 30s, single daughter. One sister was married, not doing so well financially. One brother was kind of a laborer, just odd jobs. Father has chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, and so on. The mother, who used to run the cooking stall, had a stroke. So she has this hemiparesis on one side, and she has diabetes, so she has amputation on the other side. So this mother really can't do anything for herself at all. So Rebecca will get up 5 in the morning, prepares the food for the day, gets the mother bathed and all that, sits her in front of the TV, and then she goes off to work. It takes an hour to commute, so she leaves the house about 7:30, gets to work by 8:30, work. And then he runs home at lunchtime to change the mom's diaper, because the mom's been sitting there all day in the same seat, changes the diaper, and then gets her lunch, and then runs back to work. Okay, and comes home, thinks all over again. So she was exhausted, and she often has to take time off to take her to the doctor's office. So she kept getting fired because she couldn't keep her job. So I think fundamentally it's really hard. My whole story is it's really, really hard for caregivers. Sometimes we could be a bit judgmental about them being difficult, and I think it's just something that really we can't judge people so harshly. Okay, my timing's moving, so I'm just going to say one more thing. Okay. About the importance of prevention. We think a lot about care when they need the care. We don't think enough about preventing them from getting care. So I think this is something that we want to make sure to keep people strong, keep people resilient, reduce social isolation, all that, and move people towards the red zone, the healthy zone, as much as possible. So we reduce the people who would need long-term care in the future. So there's something we don't think about enough, which I will urge all of us do. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. We should know why we need long-term care, and this is a long-term care framework of WHO, so I'm sure that a speaker following me will speak about that. But the last thing, just a nice, happy story. This is a lady we took care of some years ago. This is her celebrating her birthday with her team, and she threw a big party. This is a team that took care of the volunteer, the program administrator, a nurse, and all that. And this is a favorite nurse. It was her 100th birthday, and we started taking care of her when she was 80. When they were trying to send her to a nursing home, and she said no, over her dead body again. We just created a support system for her, and then she lived for another 20 years. So anyway, this long story to say that we do it well. It's a wonderful, happy ending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsao. What you really laid the groundwork for was robust discussions, because, each of those elements that you talked about will be talked about with the lens of culture and the lens of gender and the lens of economics and the lens of social and economic systems and the business models across the day. So thank you very much. A phrase that you used a couple of times is what matters to us. And what matters to us depends on the person and the environment in which we live. And that leads me on to and connects well with our next speaker. And as I said, the world is very small in this field. And so Vanya and I know one another in a different lifetime. And you very kindly said that you don't expect a Spanish accent, so thank you. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vanya de la Fuente. So Vanya, what you're doing today is really representing, the thoughts of WHO in terms of the long-term care framework. I want to pay tribute to Dr. Hiebang Zhang from WHO, who wasn't able to be with us today, but was really instrumental in helping to make this meeting happen. So Vanya is a medical doctor and a social cultural anthropologist who works as an independent senior consultant in healthy ageing, offering technical and strategic advice to different entities around the world to help improve the lives of older people, their families and communities. That's a pretty cookie-cutter bio, so you need to fix that up, Vanya, because what you haven't said in this part is your attention to detail, the rigour within which you think about a problem and actually step out the details to understand and uncover the evidence. And I'm proud to know you as a friend and colleague, but also one of those leaders in the development of the global campaign to combat ageism. And so please, we will make sure that it's on the conference app, but each and every one of you should be signing up to be part of the WHO Global Compact, the global campaign to combat ageism, and I think I need coffee too. So please join with me in welcoming Vanya to the podium. Thank you very much.
Distinguished delegates and colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank the IFA for inviting me to contribute to this first meeting on long-term care. I will start with a disclaimer. Based on what Jane is saying, I will be talking here today about WHO's long-term care framework, but I no longer work for WHO. I stopped working for WHO at the very end of last year, and I'm now working as an independent senior consultant, as Jane mentioned. But before I give you an overview of the WHO's long-term care framework, I wanted to present several reasons as to why we need long-term care systems around the world. And the most fundamental reason why we need these long-term care systems is that they can enable older people who are at risk or who have significant losses of intrinsic capacity to maintain a level of functioning that is consistent with their basic human rights and dignity. But there are other reasons why we need long-term care systems, and we heard about some of these before. Our increasing longevity is not being coupled with similar gains in our healthy life expectancy. Healthy life expectancy, this means, is not keeping up with our increases in life expectancy across the world. This means that 2 out of 3 people, older people, are likely to need care and support from others to perform activities of daily living at some point. And globally, it is estimated that 142 million older people are unable to meet their basic needs independently. Access to long-term care services can also delay or slow down the loss of intrinsic capacity, allowing people to live independently for longer. And we've heard about this from Marianne Tsao. Long-term care is not just about providing care for those people who already have significant loss of capacity. Sometimes, through the provision of long-term care, we can actually reverse some of those declines. Long-term care systems can also help to reduce the inappropriate use of acute healthcare services, helping families avoid catastrophic expenditures. We also need long-term care systems because relying on unpaid informal care is not sustainable. In Europe, estimates suggest that informal care accounts for as much as 80% of all long-term care. And this percentage is higher in those contexts where long-term care systems are not available or are underdeveloped. As family decreases, and we've heard about this, family sizes are decreasing, people are moving away to urban areas, often leaving older people behind, and women are entering the workforce more and more. This means that the need for quality formal long-term care is increasing around the world. There is a growing mismatch between these growing needs and the supply for caregivers across countries. So the need to invest in developing and formalizing the provision of long-term care services is growing. Also, when the responsibility of care falls on women, and this is the case today, it perpetuates gender inequities. We've already heard about this. Most caregivers are women, both in the informal and the formal long-term care settings. In Europe, women represent close to 2/3 of informal caregivers, and they outnumber men almost 9-to-1 in the formal long-term care workforce. Another important reason why we need long-term care systems is that there's a great need to have them precisely where they're mostly lacking, which increases suffering, it reduces the quality of life of older people who need them, and places a very heavy burden on caregivers. Available data suggests that there's a higher prevalence of care dependence precisely in those places where long-term care systems are generally lacking. And we know that 80% of all older people in the world will be living in low and middle-income countries by 2050. Again, these are precisely the places where these long-term care systems are mostly lacking. But this doesn't mean that long-term care systems are fine in higher-income countries. In fact, what we know is that the readiness of long-term care systems in these other settings is also very limited. And I'll show you some examples as to why I'm saying this. As you see in this graph, half of people with limitations living at home do not receive sufficient long-term care across OECD countries. And it's important to emphasize something, again, that I'm picking up from Marianne Sau, which is that older people just want to remain at home even when they need long-term care. We want to keep control of our lives as much as possible. And obviously, removing us from our neighborhood, from the people that we know, is a way of eliminating and pulling that control that we have in our lives. And unfortunately, what we see is that even though older people wish to remain at home to receive that long-term care, they're often not able to because services are not available. In fact, the proportion of long-term care recipients who received care at home in Europe rose only marginally from 67 to 68% between 2009 and 2019. In 10 years, it only rose 1%. The COVID-19 pandemic also very clearly showed the many gaps and inefficiencies of long-term care systems across the world, including high-income countries. Community-based long-term care is just not an option in many places, despite older people's preference to receive this care where they already live. WHO's work on long-term care is driven by the UN Decade of Healthy Aging that devotes 1 of 4 action areas to providing older people with access to long-term care. It's the last of the 4 action areas that you see projected on this slide. And there are several actions in the Plan of Action for the Decade of Healthy Aging that specifically indicate what the WHO Secretariat should be doing with other UN agencies to advance and provide long-term care across the world. The first one of these focuses on providing technical support for national situation analysis of long-term care. And this is where the WHO long-term care framework fits in. There are, of course, other actions that the WHO Secretariat is responsible for, including the design of tools and guidance for a minimum package of long-term care, the provision of online resources to support and to train informal caregivers. We've heard already that there's often a gap that many of these caregivers have never received any form of training to provide adequate, high-quality care. There's also the need to improve the working conditions of care workers, to ensure that they have a dignified career progression, that they have promotion opportunities, that they're paid, and also recognized in society. Oftentimes, the role of caregivers is not sufficiently recognized. And finally, there's that action about assessing the health impact of social protection programs, including pensions. After I delve into the WHO's framework on long-term care, I will be also touching on a few other actions that the WHO is currently working on. But if we start with the tool, what is it? What is WHO's integrated continuum of long-term care? This is a framework, it's a tool to help assess country readiness for the implementation of long-term care services. It aims to guide countries in assessing system-level components to implement sustainable and equitable long-term care actions. By applying this framework, countries can begin to develop and shape their long-term care system. Who is it for? It's intended for governments and for policymakers, both at national and subnational levels. Of course, the way that it may be implemented may be different depending on the specific structure of the country. But many of the actions included in the framework may also be relevant for other stakeholders at the country level, including non-governmental organizations that may be supporting the development of long-term care, also healthcare providers and development partners. Those in academic institutions may also find this document helpful for identifying areas that require further research. Underpinning this framework is the notion that long-term care's fundamental aim, is to optimize functional ability for those who are at high risk or who already have significant declines in intrinsic capacity. This makes functional ability the ultimate goal of long-term care, which requires addressing the 5 domains of functional ability, which you see here, and they include older people's abilities to learn, grow, and make decisions, to be mobile, to build and maintain relationships, to contribute to their communities, and to meet their basic needs. The framework also parts from this understanding that care dependence is not considered a fixed state. For example, through rehabilitation, through good nutrition and physical activity, we might improve an older person's capacity to the point that they no longer need long-term care or that the care needs diminish. The framework considers that every long-term care system around the world should consider the following key principles that you see here. First, governments need to take overall responsibility for the stewardship of long-term care systems. Second, the long-term care system needs to be affordable, accessible, and equitable. And it must build on existing health and social care systems. It doesn't need to start from scratch. In countries where we may have more developed health systems, long-term care could make use of the existing healthcare system infrastructure as a basis. And in countries with more limited health systems, perhaps the focus should be on mainstreaming long-term care into primary healthcare provision as part of a wider reorientation of primary healthcare to non-communicable diseases. The third point, and this is a fundamental point, is that the long-term care system must uphold the human rights of older people and their caregivers. And fourth, it must be person-centered. It needs to orient around the needs and the wants of the older person. And it should be provided in a non-fragmented way and in a continuum with other services. So this is what the overall framework looks like. We have the ultimate outcome of long-term care at the top. We have the principles that I just mentioned. And then there are 6 key elements that need to be evaluated and which are required to achieve an integrated continuum of long-term care and to facilitate this integration of long-term care services with existing health and social care systems. The 6 elements, which may be a bit small on the slide, they include governance, sustainable financing, information monitoring and evaluation, workforce, service delivery, and finally, innovation and research. I will be walking through each of these elements and providing some examples for some of them that come from different countries. If we start with governance, there are some typical problems that we find in different parts of the world with governance, which is complex, and oftentimes it's uncoordinated and fragmented among public and private sectors. We have also unpaid and paid caregivers, and then we have health and social care systems and other sectors and ministries that often do not talk to each other. So the vision behind the long-term care framework of WHO is that the government needs to take that leadership role and provide stewardship to engage and coordinate long-term care across these multiple sectors and ministries that will need to be involved, and engaging the full range of actors and empowering communities. We need to have that dedicated multi-sectoral coordinating body at the national level and at the subnational level to facilitate that coordination. Having long-term care legislation, for example, at the national level can be an important starting point for formulating the subsequent strategies and roadmaps that we may need for long-term care at the country level. Also very important when we talk about governance is to talk about accountability. We need to have sufficiently defined accountability measures to ensure that all of the actors in the system are actually held publicly accountable for the services that we're providing, so that we don't end up with situations like the situations that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, where many older people were left to die in long-term care institutions with no access to any services beyond that institution, and with no outcomes and no compensation for the great suffering that happened during the pandemic. We also need sustainable financing to make sure that that long-term care system can be sustainable in the long run. And we encounter many different problems when we talk about financing of long-term care system. Due to common misperceptions that long-term care is too costly and endless and that older people do not contribute to the economy, long-term care today is largely underfunded by the public sector. As you see on the slide, close to half of older people are not covered by any type of formal provision of long-term care services. And average public expenditure is less than 1% of gross domestic product for this. But the vision is to have sustainable and equitable financing for long-term care that actually protects people from impoverishment. If we have sustainable financing, we will make sure that older people who need this type of care do not have to pay out of pocket, which often means that many older people will never have access to long-term care when they need it. Public funding of long-term care can also help reduce those health system costs and generate economic benefits through contributions from healthy older people and supported carers, and also through jobs that may be created through the establishment of a care economy. And I'm providing here an example from Japan when it comes to sustainable financing. As you see here, the Japanese government in the year 2000, they implemented the national long-term care insurance system to try to reduce the financial and labor burden on carers. So now all Japanese citizens are required to pay what is called a long-term care insurance premium when they reach the age of 40, in addition to the regular healthcare insurance premiums. These are for people aged 65 plus, and they are determined by income status of the person and the household, which means obviously that those who have more access to resources will have to pay more for the premium, and those who have a lower income will either not have to pay or will have to pay a reduced premium. Then when using long-term care insurance services, average citizens would pay around 10% of the service fee. And as I mentioned, those with high income will have to pay a higher percentage, which is between 20 and 30%. Welfare recipients, in turn, are exempt from having to pay for this, both for the premium and the co-payment. The Japanese government also implemented an incentive system in 2018, this is fairly recent, to try to improve also the effectiveness of insurance efforts. This is just an example from one country, but it shows that sustainable financing can be embedded into long-term care systems if we put our minds to it. If we look at information monitoring and evaluation systems, some of the problems that we're encountering at the moment in different countries is that information about and the monitoring of long-term care provision and outcomes is largely lacking or fragmented. We mostly have information from higher income countries. We would like to have a lot more information from how long-term care is being provided, even if a system is not in place in other contexts around the world. Also, data may cover only older people in poverty or with disabilities, while the needs of other older people are invisible and so they're ignored. So again, we need to understand much better what the situation of long-term care provision is in different contexts, how older people in need of care are living, and how caregivers are also supporting that care. A very important challenge that I also wanted to flag here is the challenge related to the data that exists from systems that tend to be separated and not necessarily speaking to each other, which is the data that may come from the healthcare system and data that may come from social care system. If they're separated, then it's very difficult to integrate that data and really follow the older person across the types of services that they may be accessing. Our vision is that a person's health and social status and needs are proactively identified and assessed, and that person-centered data on the provision of long-term care services are interoperable between health and social care systems to improve that coordination and the quality of services that are provided. We also need to identify and understand carers' needs so that we can respond to those needs, so that we can better train and provide respite care or whatever other types of solutions that we may need. Unless we know what carers are needing, we won't be able to address those needs correspondingly along the continuum of care. I have an example here for you from the Republic of Korea related to this area. So the Republic of Korea has a public long-term insurance, which is operated by the National Health Insurance Services, which is under the Ministry of Health. The NHIS has a nationwide integrated information system for the long-term care insurance that provides all long-term care institutions across the country with computerized, standardized forms that actually facilitate that exchange of data and information between the providers and also the insurance. The personal data of beneficiaries, and this is important, is encrypted in the system to protect privacy. But it's great to have this type of service available because basically it addresses one of the challenges that I was mentioning, which is that the long-term and healthcare records of nationals can be linked and analyzed by this single insurance for strategic planning and for policy formulation and decision-making. The systems speak to each other, so we actually have an accurate picture of what is happening with that older person with significant declines of capacity. If we focus now on the workforce, there are many problems that we're encountering with the workforce in long-term care. But some problems that I wanted to pick up on today and flag today before we continue with the meeting is that there's not enough formally trained and paid care workers to provide long-term care to older people who require it. So that's a fundamental gap in the system today. We have many caregivers around the world, but they're not necessarily trained. Most care depends on unpaid carers, mostly women, family members or volunteers, again, without formal training. We have to address this gap. We have to see how we're going to make the system sustainable. As mentioned, 80% of care today is provided by informal caregivers. And the largest percentage of those have never received any form of training. Many unpaid carers are themselves older people, and this is something that is often forgotten. People assume that older people are recipients of care without realizing that older people are often givers of care to other family members. And they may face poor working conditions and precarious employment. And finally, family carers are often overburdened, which lead to burnout and inadequate care. Sometimes this situation can even lead to elder abuse. So again, we need to provide the support systems in place if we're going to sustain in some way or form that informal caregiving so that informal carers can receive respite care and that training that they require. So our vision is precisely that unpaid carers and paid care providers receive adequate training, are coordinated in the system to provide that integrated continuum of care, and that they receive support and decent compensation to maintain a skilled workforce. I brought an example here from Brazil, where the city of Belo Horizonte established a scheme to develop and support care skills for community-based long-term care in poor neighborhoods through municipality funding. Care support workers are basically recruited from local communities, they're trained, and they're paid a minimum wage. And they work very closely with a small number of families, and they provide each between 10 and 40 hours of support, offering those families some respite. And we're also working with them to build some skills and competencies so that they can better care for their family members. And they also continue to support older people who are then hospitalized, which makes the transition back home and into the community much easier. They're jointly supervised by staff from health and social assistance centers, which has strengthened that coordination across agencies. And evaluations have shown that on a modest budget, a very modest budget, this scheme improved care outcomes for dependent older people. It also eased the burden on caregivers, and reduced the unplanned use of health services. This scheme has been operating over a decade now in this city, and the Federal Ministry of Health is actually looking to potentially scale it up in other cities to establish very similar interventions. If we move on to service delivery, some typical problems that we find here is that the provision of health and social care is not integrated, but is instead fragmented and uncoordinated. And there are also gaps in the types of services that are offered, and access and quality is uneven. This means that older people do not receive the care that they need, and that the preferences of older people to age in place are not met. Our vision is that the individual needs of older people are assessed and described in person-centered plans, and that they are addressed with integrated and coordinated health and social care services that cover that continuum of care: prevention, promotion, rehabilitation, curative, and palliative care. Innovation and research. Some challenges. First, that the range of assistive products that is required is limited, and that the functionality and the cost of many of these products present still many barriers across the world. The potential of digital health technologies to aid older people has not yet been sufficiently explored in the realm of long-term care. And also, older people have relatively limited access and capacity to use digital communication and information tools. But our vision is that the needs and preferences of older people and their caregivers that are met with appropriate and affordable technologies and products. We also need to have a defined research agenda and to fund that research agenda to really advance knowledge on long-term care service provision. Now, the WHO Integrated Continuum of Long-Term Care framework, it comes together with a checklist to basically help countries assess their existing systems, to identify what gaps exist, and to be able to plan for next steps. It uses a very easy and simple traffic light system to indicate if an action is not available, if it's partially there and functional, or if it's fully functional. The checklist is to be used as a general reference tool. It needs to be adapted, obviously, to national and local context. And what's really important is that it is used periodically to really monitor the progress of the country in preparing to develop that long-term care system. Now that I've talked about the WHO's long-term care system, I wanted to briefly touch on other work of the WHO in the realm of long-term care. First, the WHO is working on the development of a service package of long-term care interventions as part of our work on universal health coverage. So this is really about recommending a minimum list of interventions to be integrated into UHC national health systems. There's also work being carried out to support those long-term care assessments in countries, again, to try to integrate long-term care as part of health service delivery at national and subnational level. To document and share good practices of long-term care. Again, we need to learn much more about the ways in which long-term care is being provided across low, middle, and high-income countries so that we can enable that knowledge sharing between countries and hopefully ignite more action in this area. On long-term care financing, the WHO is collaborating with the WHO COBE Center in developing financing guidance, including case studies from low, middle-income countries where we don't have that much information. And finally, the WHO is developing training materials to support that training and support for informal carers. As part of this, and also building on the momentum that will be generated in this meeting today, A proposal could also be made to form a sort of technical interagency working group on long-term care. And I did want to share with you that the World Health Organization is planning to invite partners in long-term care to a global long-term care meeting that will be taking place in Seoul in November of this year. I wanted to thank all of you very much for your attention, and I did want to extend a special thanks to Hyobom Yang from WHO headquarters, who could unfortunately not make it to this conference, but did provide me with great insights from WHO headquarters. You can contact me via email or Twitter, or even better, in person, now that I believe we're going to break for a coffee. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us this morning. You know, this morning has really set the scene for many robust discussions this afternoon. I think across the day, I think one of the most important things that you talked about was the framework, and that, you know, whether we are in low, middle income countries or high income countries, it's about trying to understand what the principles are and the metrics, and how do we come together to learn from one another. There is no one model that's gold standard. You know, we are all struggling to understand how to create that environment that not only serves the needs of those with high stable capacity, but those with significant loss of capacity. So please join with me in thanking Graham Pryor, Mr. Bernard Chan, Dr. Sabine Henning, Dr. Marianne Sau, and Dr. Vanya de la Fuente. And I'm desperate for tea. I'm sure you're desperate for coffee. It's now 10:20. If we can come back in 20 minutes, we will be starting again. And it's my great pleasure to have Dan Levitt, Mr. Dan Levitt, CEO of Kin Village in Canada and IFA Director, to be moderating. So please go and grab your coffee and eats. Thank you.